It's like my fifth period English class. Well, a lot of familiar faces. It's great you came today. We appreciate it. And I want. It's close. But Roy consented to do the program today, and he has local connection. It appears from the reception that Roy got earlier that many of you know about him. He was a contract logging supervisor for Weyerhaeuser after college, and his responsibilities included the Deep River and Naysel areas. He managed the logging operations for Rainier on the northern Olympic Peninsula before going on to becoming the vice president of pulp and forest products for Rainier, with headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut. So, Roy, you're up, my friend, and thank you for giving up your Sunday to spend with us.
You bet. Here we are, sir.
Thank you.
All right, I think I'm going to stand up. Can you hear me okay? I have a big voice, so I could probably throw this away. Hey, Mike.
Is it okay if I record it?
Oh my gosh, okay, sure.
No pressure.
Well, let me just, I see a number of people here from Oysterville anyway, from that forum I attended, so I'll just tell you maybe a little bit about the genesis of my participation there and how this paper came to be. Dave Williams, the former president of Shore Bank Pacific, used to be my banker in a prior life, a company I formed. And he has a cousin who's an absolute dynamo sitting right over here. And he roped me into this discussion about logging Pacific County. And Cindy contacted me and said, we'd like you to participate. And so anyway, I sat in that round table with Steve and with others, Bob and others, and it was really fun. It was fun because a lot of people have a lot of experience that I don't have. That's just the way it is. I'm 74, almost 75 years old. I've been in the forest products industry for about 50 years. But there are people in here that have more experience than I do. I know for a fact. One of them was my first boss, Jim Hillary, when I was 16 years old. So anyway, and I know a number of you. So feel free at any point to interrupt me. What I did to prepare for that session at Oysterville was to just sit down on my computer and write down, try to segregate the logging history of Pacific County into discrete chunks I call eras, and then try to look for common characteristics amongst the eras. This is the engineer in me, I guess. And that's kind of how I organize my thinking, and I organize the paper that Steve's working on right now. And what it really forced me to do was do a lot of research. Somebody said, if you want to learn something, try to teach it. And so anyway, I did a lot of research, especially on the first era, which was the era up to 1900. And that was the era that really was dominated by Native people. There just weren't very many people here. At that point, Northern Pacific had just pushed its way into Tacoma. That's the year 1900 that Frederick Weyerhaeuser made his deal with the Northern Pacific, ended up with, lion's share of the commercial timber, best commercial timber in the Pacific Northwest. There are just a number of things that happened around 1900 that really seemed to shift things, and not the least of which smallpox had run its course with the native tribes. And according to one of my really good sources, which is James Swan, if you haven't read this, it's a great read. I assume most of you had, written in 1850s. But even at that point, the local tribes were down to only like 100 people. They had just been absolutely devastated by smallpox, and there weren't that many around. So that was another kind of a threshold that, yes ma'am?
So was it the Chinook tribe?
It was, there was mixing, the best I can tell, but it was the Chinook tribe, the Shoalwater tribe, made its way back and forth all the time to the Columbia. So they were mainly the Chinook, although in the upper valley, there was mixing from the inland tribes and northern tribes as well. So, and I'm not an expert, as I said, I've read everything I could read to try to be a little bit more expert in them. What is clear when you look at their sources of energy and their focus of their logging, it was western red cedar, very clearly. They had virtually no impact on the forests because what they took for the most part is cedar. And if you haven't read this book, and you're interested, this is a phenomenal book. I went down to the Shoalwater Bay Museum, and those guys are great too. I may have been the only one there, but they took a lot of interest in me and showed me this book. And the book explains just how pivotal to the culture the cedar was. And the lengths they went to try to protect the cedars and not even kill the cedars, let alone the other species. Ripping the inner bark from cedar trees in a very deliberate fashion, falling trees, picking up trees, etc. Anyway, they were the first loggers, if you will, and their source of energy was water, and they traveled long and far. And they were not isolated, solitary people. They traded a lot. And the more I read, the more interesting I found that. When the whites came, it wasn't a huge transition for the native people here to say, yeah, we're prepared to trade with you. That's something they did all the time. And what did they trade? They traded with tribes up and down the west coast. They traded elk hides. Elk hides were a form of armor that were highly prized by all the tribes. And the Haidans and the Klingits, the northern Indians, didn't have those hides, but they did have these shells, these small shells that you see kind of the Indian headdresses and the like, and they were almost like a currency. And they were found off the shores of Vancouver Island. The Indians to the north way to the north had to cover big expanses of water, so they made big canoes. So rather than make canoes down here in Shoalwater Bay that were of that size, they didn't have the Alaska yellow cedar they had in Alaska. They traded for it. They traded slaves. Slaves were a very real part of that economy, but they traded, and they traded long, long distances, even up and down the Columbia River, long, long distances. So that's kind of the first era. The loggers were the native people. Their focus was the cedar, and their source of energy was really just water travel, and their own physical efforts. And they were really quite ingenious. I've spent a long time in what I've learned reading about this. Just the way they felled trees. They would take rocks and put them in the fire until they got very hot. And then they carved a little niche in the cedar tree and put those hot rocks in, and when they got charred, they take a stone club and club out that char, and then start all over again. And they had like they take western hemlock boughs and put them in water to keep the char the right temperature. Just really ingenious stuff they did to fell trees, which of course they made into everything. Baskets, watertight baskets, homes, everything they required. And what was really, compared to some of the other native people throughout North America, a really pretty affluent lifestyle because they had all these salmon and they had all these shellfish, etc. So that's kind of the first era. Any questions? As I said, I've mainly just read about this and talked to people like the folks in Shoalwater. But any questions or comments? Okay, I'll move on to the next era then. And the next era, really, I've got some inside information finally. My stepfather, Les Wilson, was a character in and of himself. I see that snotty already. He was a real character. Early in his career, he was a partner with his stepfather, Tony Alexander. And Tony Alexander was kind of a legend. He was a logging manager for Sunset Logging Company up Mill Creek back when that was really the timber stand that was being logged. And he was very familiar with the logging methods of that next era, 1900 and 1930, and very much engaged in it. I read in Southwestern and actually read some other notes that Grandma Beulah left behind from her interviews with Tony. And boy, it's just a shame we don't all do this with our grandparents, or we don't do it with each other. She sat down and recognized, and Beulah was involved with the Historical Society way back when. She recognized how valuable a lot of his experience was, and she was a good writer, and she wrote out a lot of his recollections. But he began in the woods. His dad immigrated from Scotland to Cathlemon, which was logging a little bit earlier, like 1870s. Came to Willapa, down there by Mike's country, and his dad semi-retired in that area and bought some property in Willapa, and sold his oxen for logging. And when he sold his oxen, he was a little bit concerned that the guy he sold them to wasn't really trustworthy. He might beat up the oxen. So he sent 9-year-old Tony out with him to take care of the oxen and to grease the skids. So he really did begin logging when he was about 9 years old. So back to your Fair Labor Standards Act, Jim. You employed a 16-year-old, that was nothing compared to the previous era. But Tony had phenomenal experience, and one of the beautiful things I was able to do is spend a lot of time with him in his boat, going up and down the Willapa River fishing for blueback, and he'd point out the log dumps, and he'd point out all the items, and he'd tell me stories. So that's the benefit I have. But really, most of what I've got in the paper, I've taken from Beulah's discussions with Tony about that era. What were the big changes during that era? Logging went from, can you follow it into the stream and use screw jacks and manual labor to basically get the logs into the water, where sailing ships would hand winch them in the back of the ship to take them for piling and for poles down to San Francisco. And the ships were infrequently lost, coming or going at the end of the day. It went from that to where the logging moved more back up into the upper areas like Mill Creek, where I grew up. And they splash dam. They learned how to build, or they perfected the splash dam. And you'll see, if you ever get to see my paper, I've got actually found, I think somewhere in your archives, Steve, in South Bend, I found a map of a lot of the splash dams around. And then I got a lot of material that Tony, after he passed away, was given to me. I've got some pictures, and one of them is a splash dam on Mill Creek that he left me. But what they did is they built a splash dam. They use oxen initially to drag the logs down into little creek beds like Mill Creek, which was a big one. And they had multiple camps. And then 2 or 3 times a year when we had a big freshet, big rainstorm, there were people that were trained to basically they'd open up the splash dam, all those logs would come downstream. And people like Les Wilson's dad, Harley, were known as some of the log drivers that would run along the bank with a peavey and try to get them back out of the water before they got killed, or before the log got permanently held up and had to wait for the next freshet. So that's pretty much what happened from an energy perspective. In the middle of this era, this 1900 and 1930 era, steam began to come into play. And with the steam came logging railroads, and logging railroads, and allowed the loggers to get into areas and a little bit more efficiently remove the logs in areas that were difficult to reach. Although Jim and I used to hunt up the East Fork of the Nacelle on an old railroad grade, and they did a very imperfect job of logging, even up there back in that era. But they did, they went after the very best, and for the most part, they got it. The other thing, obviously, the steam brought them was the gold beer donkey initially, and then steam yarders, and eventually somebody said, let's hang a block up in a tree, and they began climbing trees, and began becoming just a heck of a lot more productive. So steam came into being, the animals took less and less a role, splash damming took less and less a role, and then later, and this is almost at the end of this era, bulldozers began to show up. And bulldozers were important because the steam shovels that built the railroad grades up into all these areas could only just lift what they could lift and drop it right alongside of them. So they had to build trestles. Every time you come across one of these big stream beds, you had to build this huge big trestle, which was very, very demanding. And what a cat could do is you could build a groove and they could carry a fill, so sometimes doing a lot of damage in the process to these streams. But they could carry a fill so you could build a logging road once they had trucks as well to begin to take the logs out. That's a lot I just went through. Questions, comments? Yeah.
The dam up the Willapa here, was that a splash dam or was it just for power?
You know, I think that was for power. I don't know. For the most part, I know in Mill Creek, for instance, where I grew up, the splash dams were really up in the tributaries. It would very much surprise you. You see, if it's a stream that looks like it's that wide. They were little tiny streams, and it amazed me they were able to push it so far up. Yes, sir.
There were dams on the North River.
Yep.
And the South Fork of the Willapa had 2 splash dams on it.
Yep.
The South Fork of Willapa, that's here. We're,
The South Fork, where we are right now, this river that we're on had 2 splash dams on it.
Yeah.
One just up here a couple miles.
Yeah.
And
Okay,
then
that's where the power dam was.
North River had one right above Tidewater in North River.
Yes.
Was there any downstream conflict if there were landowners downstream of?
I read with great interest about, I lived right at the mouth of Mill Creek, and I could only imagine what would happen if suddenly it came down. But reading about it, we lived in a little place called Moose, actually had a school way back when. Do you believe that? And what they said is the loggers from the camps way upstream, Bert, Sunico, way upstream, would come racing down and say, get your kids out of the creek and get them away because here it comes. And that's apparently the way it worked. I didn't read of any kids or animals or whatever getting carried away, but you can only imagine the force of what must have happened. Yes,
Were these logs or only, or did you cedar blocks? Like they do
No,
some
it
places?
was pretty much logs. Cedar was, obviously they were looking for cedar, but it's a really good point because the focus of this era, and I wanted to focus each era on species, was really Douglas fir. Everything else was pretty much, well, cedar always had value because it could always be split so easily, made into shakes and shingles, just as the Indians had done before them, and could be done a lot more effectively with the tools, steel, etc., that the people of this next generation had. But it was Douglas fir. They were after Douglas fir, and hemlock was a weed species that got in the way or broke the fall of the Douglas fir. Other questions, comments? All right, well, let me move on to the next era. And this next, I didn't really plan on giving a speech. I thought this was going to be a discussion here. Yes.
You can talk about the owners.
The owners of the land, yeah. Well, I mentioned Weyerhaeuser, but there still were other private owners. There were a number of mills during this era, this 1900 to 1930 era. A number of other owners of the mills, generally private individuals. But at the end of this time period, and this is my wife Mary, and just asked the question, or prodded me to not forget something. At the end of this era, obviously was the Depression. And the Depression really changed the character of the ownership. Because you had public corporations, Crown Zellerback, Rainier, my old employer, and Weyerhaeuser had the ability to go to the stock market, raise stock funds, and with those funds they bought up these companies and bought up their ownership. So we look at the extensive ownership that Weyerhaeuser has in Pacific County, and Jim knows it well. That a lot of that came from these mill companies they bought up right after the Depression. Yes, sir.
Well, I remember a lot of these mills were built to cut their own private timber and then quit. It was kind of a cut-out, get-out era. And then Weyerhaeuser came in and bought this supposed log over land, you know, what was left, and it wasn't really logged over yet in some of the steeper gulches.
Yeah.
Equipment, so there's
Yeah,
still a lot of timber on it.
Yeah, Weyerhaeuser, you're right. Saul Simpson is really kind of famous for being one of the guys that went in behind a lot of the cutout and get out and bought up timberlands. Or he just hung on to the timber that he bought a little bit north of us. But you're right. If you read about this era, and this even into this next era following the Depression, it was really kind of like the robber barons. In the paper, I actually quote some of the old Crown Zellerback retirees. I found at the University of California, Berkeley, they have some reminiscences of these loggers from Crown Zellerback during this time period. And it was, you know, we're going to bid on this timber. You don't bid on this timber. That's not what is done. We'll give you these logs, and I don't want to see another dime bid on this stand of timber, because this is all we're going to bid. And that's the way it worked. And they say it very candidly in these transcriptions of these old loggers. They didn't know a lot about antitrust. I don't think, in fact, one of them, Steve, you read it, one of the guys says, I don't even think there were antitrust laws. They pretty much ran the place like logger barons, which I guess in many ways they were.
Was there any sabotage between owners?
No, not really. And we'll get to that in just a minute in the next era. But they began to complement each other a little bit. I'll just go to this next era. After the big, I call them the big three in Pacific County. You had Crown Zellerback, kind of the south end of the county. You had Rainier, I have to add him to the big three since I worked for him. I was a vice president for him. And you had Weyerhaeuser really owned a lot of the commercial timberlands during this time period. And they all kind of found their own niche. Weyerhaeuser was in logging, Weyerhaeuser was in sawmilling, really Douglas fir sawmilling a lot initially, and really for a long period of time till the Douglas fir, and it was phenomenal, Douglas fir stands here that were cut out. And then along came Crown Zellerback, and Crown Zellerback said, we can take that hemlock and we can make paper out of it. We can pulp it. They began to build pulp mills, and they said all those weed trees that you got, we can take that and we can grind that up. And on the north end of the peninsula, they even cut them into like cedar blocks, old growth hemlock, so they can get them out easily to get them to Port Angeles and Port Townsend to make paper. Rainier took a little bit different approach. Actually, Crown Zellerback was when it went public, had as one of its investment bankers a guy from Chicago who looked at the business plan and said, you know, I think I'm going to form my own company. And he formed Rainier. And so Rainier came in and they took a little bit different niche. Crown Silverback took the hemlock trees they could get, and they began to focus upon sawmill burners and the amount of chips that were either being disposed of in one fashion or another, and said, we're going to kind of go toward paper. And in paper, what you're looking for, and again, my technical background, so I don't want to get too carried away, but you're looking for strong fibers like Douglas fir, etc. You can use hemlock for some applications, but Douglas fir has a big fiber, so it's very strong. Rainier, on the other hand, was looking at making chemical cellulose, which is actually taking the alpha cellulose, the highest quality cellulose, out of the wood and making it into a chemical. They could then be treated by chemical companies to make things like rayon, acetate, rayon tires, that sort of thing. And that's what the Cosmopolis has done up until very recently as well. So they all kind of picked back to your question, they all kind of picked their niche, and once again, it's in the transcription. But one of the guys said, you know, we didn't really have to bother because the hemlock logs would go to us, and the Doug fir logs would go to Weyerhaeuser, and Rainier would get their hemlock in the area where they needed to get their hemlock, and we're not going to really worry too much about competition. To the day Tony died, he felt he got screwed over when he logged down by North River, and he showed me his scale tickets. He was selling old growth Douglas fir for $9 a thousand in the round. Yes, Steve?
I think it's interesting how Rainier got its name.
Yep. Began with a mountain, and then when it went public, rayon was just coming into play, and so they changed the name from Rainier to Rayon here. Yes, ma'am.
I think I remember seeing a sheet of brands that companies use to mark their wood, and were they used at this time?
They were from very early on, ways to kind of, you know, when you put all those logs in a river, and a lot of them got commingled, how do you keep them straight? And you know, there were a few bandits around, and if nothing else for firewood. And logs got washed up here and there. Yes, ma'am.
And weren't they registered with the state of Washington?
They were. They actually had a registration of brands, yeah. Any other questions? I didn't get too diverted way here. During this next era, 1930 to 1965, this is what I also have some personal involvement with, because this is when my family, personal family, moved out to the Raymond area. My mom and her family, her siblings, and my grandfather and her grandmother, who died soon after she came here, were a Danish family, second generation Danes, who were in North Dakota, and my grandfather was working in a coal mine in North Dakota, and they almost starved to death. They came out because I had an uncle that actually managed one of the sawmills in Raymond, and probably spoke enough Danish so they could all talk to one another. And they came out here. That's how my family really got involved in the woods. And my grandfather, whom you knew, a neighbor of my grandfather over here, was a logger from the moment he got out here until he died. So that's an era I know more about. The timberlands at that point, I mean, there are exceptions. There are other private individuals that own timber in the county, but the big three really dominated the timber. I talked about the kind of concentration. Probably the next big shift was the use of petroleum versus wood for the sources for steam. From the very earliest days, one of the big advantages of steam is you could pull out the nicest old growth Douglas fir and that would split so easily, you could split it up for fuel. And they all had operations splitting up fuel alongside of their yarders. But once fuel oil made its way and could make its way up on the railroads, all those machines were replaced with petroleum-powered equipment. Some of that equipment, they're actually, when I was a kid, probably back to our gym, there was John McMeekin, an old buddy of mine. We spent a whole day talking about John McMeekin, but an old crusty logger who was, anyway, talk a lot about John. He's a real good guy. But he was logging for Weyerhaeuser, and he still rigged a tree for his crew. This is clear back in the 60s, so he could make sure the crew had some appreciation for what real rigging skills were. They got spoiled by all these talkie tuners and all this technology at the end of the day. The other big thing that happened in this area during the 1930s was a guy by the name of Dr. James Nevin came to work for Harbor Plywood in Aberdeen. And Dr. Nevin had a PhD from Columbia. He had a PhD from the university in Europe. He'd studied under Dr. Leo Bakelite. He understood resins extremely well. And what he did was really revolutionary. Up until then, there had been some lathes that had peeled plywood and made veneer, but all the adhesives were water soluble. So you can imagine what a problem that was. But anyway, the very first waterproof adhesives were made in the 1930s in Aberdeen, Washington. So the old growth Douglas fir trees that were just highly prized by the plywood people were gobbled up by the plywood mills. And they were gobbled up by the plywood mills because coming up to World War II, the demand for plywood, exterior plywood, shot through the roof. I can't remember the statistics, Steve, but I think it was 65 new plywood mills. Many of them co-ops got built in the state of Washington. Plywood exploded, and it was all because of this gentleman in Hopeland who had a big impact on the forest here because the highest quality wood. When I was going to university and you learned to scale logs, you learned what a Douglas fir peeler was. So 1, 2, and 3 quality peeler. At that point, they pretty much moved beyond plywood to other cuttings and the like. But that was another major innovation during this time period. And you can't forget spruce. Spruce during both wars. Spruce was a big deal. The spruce division was in ring. I'm probably going to get into territory. People know a lot more about this than I do. But spruce logging especially for aviation applications, was also a big issue. Go ahead, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry, Steve.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned Dr. Bakelite. On Antiques Roadshow, often there's something that's
Right.
Bakelite and has some value. I didn't realize it was related to a real person. I just thought it was a trade name.
It is a trade name, and the company still exists. Now you're going to get me in my wood chemistry thing, and I'll get carried away. But I constructed a company in Hopeland that to this day makes a product called Paperstone. It's a countertop material and used for skateboard ramps and other. It's essentially kind of a bakelite. It takes wood fiber and it mixes it with resin. Same kinds of resins. In the case of Paperstone, we use things like natural sources of phenol, like cashew nut shell liquid, and other materials to make this. Once again, I don't want to get very into the weeds. Yes?
Yeah, hemlock became used for dimension lumber with the advent of dry kilns.
Exactly. And Douglas fir remained a great product that was sold in large volumes, even in the state of California. Yeah, absolutely.
Excuse me, was the plywood boom due to the war effort, or did
It really was.
Okay.
It really was. I can find the statistics here, but during the war, the demand just skyrocketed. And then, the new plants were, is it chicken and egg? Is it the supply or is it the demand? Once the supply was there, the demand just exploded. And I can't remember the quote here, but it's something like, selling plywood was like, whatever, it was ridiculously easy, and they could compete for all the logs. Okay, the next era that I looked at is kind of that 1930 to 1965 era, and that included the Columbus Day storm. And now getting in here, I see heads nodding, it's more the era I remember. I remember my parents' bedroom window blowing out. I remember the power lights going through the roof of our barn and sparks flying around. And I remember a hunting season starting the next day. And my stepfather, Pop, said, we're not staying home. This is going to be a really good time to go hunting. So we had to throw a power saw in the back of the pickup, and we spent most of the day just cutting trees out of the road to get out to wherever Jim knows Les real well. It wasn't going to keep you from going deer hunting. So anyway, but what it did do is it blew down, and I got the statistics in this paper. It blew down, as you're well aware, just humongous amounts of timber. And a lot of it, as you said, Mr. King, were hemlock trees, really nice hemlock trees. And what that did, it's back to the chicken and egg supply and demand situation. You had the war over, you had housing starts booming in Japan, just headed up on a steep trajectory. And what do we have? We have docks and we have hemlock trees. We got to get out of here. And we don't have near enough mills to cut all these hemlock trees. They have to be cut or they're not going to be around very long. They're not going to last very long. So we entered the log export market in a very big way, and it just boomed from there. Billions and billions of board feet that made its way to the river and then aboard ships here in Pacific County, and Grays Harbor County, and Astoria, all up and down the coast, any of those areas that were impacted by the Columbus Day storm. So that's the Columbus Day storm was another of the major issues. And was really a major factor in use of the forest during that time period. The other thing that happened during that time period was there was more mechanization of kind of the historical logging methods. I mentioned the bulldozers earlier, but you had steel spar poles beginning to replace wood. It was getting hard to even find these big dead firs you wanted to hang rigging and to do rigging. And it became more difficult to find the people the further that went along. So you had mobile spars, steel spars. You had hay racks that had been used when Pop, my stepfather, went to work for Weyerhaeuser after Jippo logging. He was a head log loader for Weyerhaeuser. He worked under a heel boom with tongs, and you'd have to set tongs on every log, and then you'd have to shape the tongs after you put the logs on a truck. But you had new devices like grapples, cable grapples were being used to load trucks, and truck roads became a much bigger factor at that point. As I mentioned earlier, bulldozers had a profound effect. They were used with arches to pull logs long distances. There were a lot of them after the war available. Once again, chicken and egg. And as I said, they made the construction of side-cast roads and roads with earth and fill a lot easier. Power saws improved or were developed during this era. Two-man saws, humongous things. I I remember when I worked for the DNR, I had a little bit of experience running a power saw, cutting firewood, so John Heinz, who was Jim's woods foreman, we came across an old growth Douglas fir that had come across the road, and we were brushing roads. This was our charge when we were fighting forest fires. And John said, "You're our power saw operator." And anyway, there was a McCulloch chainsaw. I could barely lift. I could barely get it off the ground. But at that age, being pretty full of myself and flattered by the fact that John said, "Yeah, you're our power saw guy," I ended up running that power saw a little bit for, I can remember how terrified I was. I went, quick story, I went home, with a big old chainsaw like that, round chain, and I knew how to sharpen it, but I couldn't get it sharp enough. So I gnawed away on this huge, big old growth tree that had come across the road. And I wasn't even close to getting down, and I could see it was bound. I was gonna end up getting the saw bound in this huge, big log. So I walked home and went to dinner. Pop was in from cutting timber, and of course, he probably led whatever he told me with "you dumb shit." That was generally how I proceeded everything. But he said, "What you gotta do is you gotta get that chain even sharper, you know." And he probably said something about my bad chain sharpening, but I was by far the best chain sharpener at the DNR headquarters. But anyway, I got the chain as sharp as I could, and he said, "What you gotta do is you gotta take that big chainsaw and bore all the way through that old growth log, and then you cut down and it'll break off, and you won't have any problem." And I mean, when I started boring and getting kicked by this humongous machine, I thought, I'm done for. And when the log finally broke on the road and made a big crashing sound, the whole crew was really impressed. And I was impressed to be alive. So anyway, that's my experience with those big old original chainsaws.
You're just lucky it started.
Yeah. Joe Paulus was actually, you remember, he had been a cutter for a while, but he was smart, but if he didn't stick around very long, he was kind of a fire warden, Jim, and so anyway, I think he was concerned enough for my survival that he stopped by and offered a tip here and there, and how to start it and avoid having my arm jerked out, because it had tremendous compression. It didn't have compression releases at that time, but anyway, Joe deserved a little bit of credit for me not getting killed. But he didn't stick around to watch the end of it. So anyway, this next era, and we're getting into an era that I know personally very well, but this 1965 to 1980 era is the era of really the big three and companies, and really the last of the good times. If you want to get down to it, the really good times for the timber industry and the communities dependent upon it were ended in the 80s. In about 1980, things changed just dramatically, and I'll talk about that. I can talk about that a lot because I lived through it. I was a young logging engineer, as Steve said, worked for Weyerhaeuser in Longview, managed contract loggers to the best of my ability. I did the oak fields and the other characters that frequented this part of the world, the best of my abilities. And then eventually I got understanding that I didn't know enough about the business side of the enterprise. So I went off and I got a graduate degree. And then I came back and I went to work for my employer. At that time I was working for an international paper company. And I was working in Portland for them, and I was their senior economic analyst for the West. And I came up with all kinds of elaborate philosophies for what they ought to be doing. Right out of graduate school, I could talk to them about marginal costs and marginal revenues and all this stuff to try to impress. I didn't impress anybody. They had pretty much made their mind up. They were going to continue to do what they'd always done. IP, and that was to log in places like Shalachi Prairie and take it through the mill of Shalachi Prairie, to log in places like Bond, where my wife and I lived, and take those logs to the plywood mill, the sawmill there, et cetera. They were really stuck in their ways at that point, and they weren't about to change. The forest species, though, had really been, lots of new markets have been developed by then. As I said, the best quality Douglas fir by then was going to the plywood guys, especially at that point. Plywood had been commoditized. It wasn't nearly as valuable. The trees weren't as valuable as they'd been earlier. Bigger knots, more knots. It wasn't as good a tree. And Japan entered, as I said, and they ended up buying a lot of the very best remaining Douglas fir trees. And they paid a price no one else could compete with. Yes, sir.
If I could take you back in the 30s for just a minute.
Sure.
There was also, during all the 30s up to the 40s, this harbor was full of Japanese ships. In those days, as I recall, it was illegal to export logs unless they had been manufactured. So,
Cans.
so they made jack squares,
Yep.
to square the log up.
Yeah.
So there were ships here all the time during that decade hauling jack squares out of here.
Yeah.
The other thing that occurred during that time is we had 2 shingle mills that popped up on the way just out of Raymond towards Alabama.
Right.
And you could always tell a shingle weaver when you saw him because
No fingers.
the 3 fingers were gone.
Yeah.
And that was a couple things.
That whole state or government regulation of log exports has had an impact didn't really talk about. But when I worked for Rainier, they had a sawmill in Hopeland, and we sold a lot of Japanese squares. But where we bought our wood was from federal and state sources that were non-exportable under the law. And we were always fighting, remember this, Jim, the substitution requirements. You can only take so much of that federal or state timber and convert it into material that goes in because you're substituting it for some of your fee wood. Anyway, there were a lot of legal regulations around. But, you know, compared to Canada, as an example, just across the border, our restrictions on log exports were, you know, and remain for the most part, just about nil. And we could spend the rest of the day talking about what the impact of that has had on unemployment, employment stability, and all that kind of stuff. But it undoubtedly has. Back to the uses during this last, as I call it, the last of the good times, this period from 65 to 80. The medium quality Douglas fir was made into green lumber, as we talked. A lot of that went to still goes to California, and made into timbers. The lowest quality Douglas fir at this point was being made into container board. It was the craft process for a different pulping process had been developed, and you can make container boxes, if you will, and it took advantage of the strength of those big Douglas fir fibers. Hemlock, the very highest quality hemlock, no question, was going to Japan. During that entire time period, the demand went up, and the exports of those and the prices went up because the Japanese, those of you that worked with them during that era and my entire career, my experience, are very astute businessmen, and they saw the end of a lot of that older timber coming, and they wanted it because it fit their wood products industry to a T. The medium quality hemlock made its way, as you said, into kiln dried lumber at that point, and into treated timbers. Hemlock treats very well, so a lot of that got put into treated wood products here in the West. In the lowest quality hemlock, no question. Some of it went into papers, but most of it went into dissolving pulp and chemical cellulose, that reducing those chips down into the elemental cellulose molecules and selling them in sheet form. Looks like paper, but it's really just concentrated forms of cellulose. The logging, what changed during this era, that last era before 1980, was the chainsaws, chisel bits came along, power saws became much, much higher power to weight ratio. Hydraulic jacks appeared. Cutters could begin to do more directional falling with hydraulic jacks. A lot of new equipment. And on the rigging side of things, hydraulic log loaders appeared for the very first time. So hydraulics began to make an appearance. One of the innovators, and I really think, I haven't had this disputed in the past, one of the real innovators that I think was changing the entire trajectory of the industry was a logger from Montesano, Washington, called Pete Papik. And John McBeacon again said, Roy, and this is, I think I was managing logging operations on the North Olympic Peninsula for Rainier. He said, you gotta get down there, you gotta go see what Pete Papik's doing. And Pete Papik had some of the latest Caterpillar log loaders, the biggest, strongest 245 cat log loaders, and he armored them like a tank sent out in combat. And he got his operators, and he had some very skilled operators, and they went off the road. They quit loading logs, and they began relaying logs. And they moved further and further out in the units, and they even, when I worked for Rainier, Rainier had an agreement with the Quinault tribe, and they were obligated, Rainier was obligated to log cedar swamps, and they didn't have particularly high volume per acre. And people like Pete Papik and Pete Papik eventually armored those shovels, and they go out in those swamps and they pick up tops and other material to keep themselves afloat. And they would discover as many logs buried in those old swamps, including logs like western white pine. Some huge western white don't even exist in the area anymore. They found these logs, but they became very adroit. And to this day, they'll shift ahead. If you go out to look at a modern logging operation, unless it's on very steep ground, and I mean very steep ground, it's going to be logged with a shovel, hydraulic load. Was a hydraulic load. It's been a lot of fun. So Pete Papik once again changed the trajectory. The other thing that happened is the log truckers, the dump truckers, and others in the states of Washington and Oregon and in British Columbia were able to get new legislation that allowed them to haul a lot more log trucks if they got more axles. And suddenly they could go from an 80,000 pound gross weight in a log truck, a 5-axle truck, with 8 axles they could go to 105.5. And they're doing that to this day. You'll see them with all these axles. So obviously that makes trucking more efficient because they can haul so much more. 1980 to 2010, that next 30 years, I'll relate to it personally. I was up, I was a business planning manager for Rainier in the West. And I wrote a 300-page business plan for Rainier, which included their timberlands, their logging, their pulp mills, their silver chemicals. They had a paper mill joint venture. They had a van load plant, if you recall, in Hoquiam. They had log export dock of their own in Hoquiam, extensive log export operation. It was really an interesting thing to do, to write this business plan. And I just about finished that task when I was told, we want you to go to Forks and run the logging operations in Forks. So anyway, I went to Forks, moved the family dutifully. Mary, how many moving van moves did we have, Mary? 15? 13? 13 moving van moves. Anyway, this happened a lot, it seemed, in the course of her career, but we only moved up there, and I was told, we want you to come back to Seattle. We have a secret meeting we want you to attend to. So I came back, and this was about 1981, 1982, fair, yeah. And I was taken into some quiet office, and I was told, we're gonna hire a consultant. And that consultant is going to determine the value, the market value of all our timberlands in the West. They're gonna go up for sale. And Roy, your job is to come up with an independent determination of what those timberlands are worth. And I remember getting back on San Juan Airlines in Seattle from SeaTac, flying back to Port Angeles and saying, I just moved my family. You know, Port Angeles, I'm working in Forks. I really like these people. I feel sorry for this community, but it's gone. The timber's gone. We don't have fee timber to support these mills. The mills are gone. That's all I could think about on the way back at the end of the day. But anyway, to make a long story short, they had a meeting with a number of people from ITT, and the consultant, Reed Collins from British Columbia, did their appraisal, and it came in well in excess of $1 billion, the value for the timberlands. And I was thankful because I was at like $1.1 billion. And they listened to all this, and the reaction out of Rainier and ITT is, no way. These timberlands are not worth $1 billion. We know about all the transactions evidence. No one's ever paid $1 billion for timber before. You know, it's just not gonna happen. We bought the entire company of Rainier, ITT did, in 1968 for $300 and some million. There's no way, and that includes the South and all the southern timberlands and sawmills and pulp mills. No way it's worth $1 billion. Well, they were going to discover shortly thereafter that it was worth $1 billion and was worth a lot more than $1 billion. Because what happened in the early 1980s is Reagan administration deregulated finance and the banking industry, and suddenly you had money looking for new places to put it. Institutional investors, pension funds, insurance companies, all these new sources of capital were saying, where are we going to put this money? And Hartford Insurance, and I actually have a friend who was a classmate of mine at Yale, Clark Binkley, who was their investment manager at Hartford Insurance at the time, and they had inherited a bunch of timberlands through some foreclosures, and they discovered that you can make a lot of money with timberlands. If you just own timberlands and just sell the logs, you can make a heck of a lot of money doing that. And I won't get into all the finance implications, but they discovered that the returns are counter-cyclical. They aren't correlated with other returns. If you put a portfolio together, and you know, once you get financial engineers in the room, they can do some amazing things. And especially when you got this wave of capital looking for some place to put it. And that's what happened. Not only did the wave of capital come and took over companies, well, I'll use the example of Crown Silverback. Sir James Goldsmith came and initially bought Diamond International for a song, and then he went after Crown Silverback, and they fought him, and they fought him. And I should find the statistics here, Steve. You're what they actually ended up getting. His history, if you're ever interested, is chronicled in a book called Billionaire. Because when he went back to France after he left the United States, he was a billionaire. And it was on the backs of our timber communities and this timber. Here, I'll just read this one section. This is in his biographer, Ivan Fallon. The Reagan administration, by regulation and policy directive, not only deregulated the U.S. banking industry from its old lending constraint, but also signaled a much more relaxed anti-monopoly stance. Not only were banks scrambling to lend money, but now there were new competitors in the lending market, like Drexel, where Michael Milken, remember Michael Milken, ended up going to prison? Invented what became known as the blind pool. He would raise $1 billion for a company, then ring up and say, here's $1 billion, let us help you buy that company. For Goldsmith, the timing was perfect.
If he could multiply his raw timber land holdings from Diamond's 1.6 million acres to 10 million acres, he could become a major market force in timber. Perhaps even the dominant force in a critical industry. Goldsmith and his Cavenham Forest Products, remember Cavenham, which was the group that he split off, ended up with what they wanted all along, 1.9 million acres of timberland at less than $100 an acre, plus $90 million in cash. Other assets were $330 million and a computer company. And he went back to France a billionaire. It was a, Mary? It was a profound experience, and especially for somebody who was, at that point I'd been in the South, I managed Kimball Cellulose plant, I was in Stamford, Connecticut, and I about had a crop full of it. Just to be honest with you, I saw what happened in communities like Raymond and Forks and other places, and what really allowed these people to do what they were able to do was their ability to export every log they wanted to export. The decline of the timber was just booming, right? Prices went through the roof. And in 1990, the federal government came out and said, we're going to list the spotted owl, which scared everybody half to death. Set aside some of the public timber, which even spurred the prices even higher. And they logged and they logged and they logged until all the financial mature timber was gone. And it was just a kind of a final spurt, and it was gone. When I left Forks, I knew that there was enough timber for about 4 years. I knew what was going to happen at Forks. Jim, we're just scratching your eye.
Just scratching.
You lived through it too.
Oh, yeah.
The other thing that happened, these financial engineers, I made the comment that this was not a time for innovation in equipment because all the equipment that used to exist was worthless. Once these big trees and big logs were gone, the sawmills that were built to consume them, the towers that were built to log them, that equipment was essentially worthless. There are people like Dahlstrom Lumber that are still doing little niches today. But what we have today are financial institutions that own those timberlands, and by financial institutions, I include Weyerhaeuser, which is now a real estate investment trust, Rainier, which is a real estate investment trust, a whole group of tax advantage, they're smart too, they managed to connive some new tax breaks as they form these new entities at the end of the day, but they control the timberlands. And what we have are trees right out of that lecture I was giving at IP when I got back from graduate school. Let me tell you about financial rotation. And it was then, as it is today, about a 40-year-old tree in the Pacific Northwest. You can't afford, if you approach it totally as a finance person approach it, you can't let a tree grow much beyond 40 years of age before you need to cut it. And that's what we have. And what that has done in kind of this last era, go ahead, Jim.
I just have a question. You're
Sure.
talking about all these investment owners.
Yep.
Where are they making their money when they exchange with each other?
I think a lot of that is gamesmanship, just to be honest with you. But I don't see any way. Obviously, you can't make money if you're just trading assets.
Yeah, but they do it all the time.
Yeah.
Well, some of their profit is growth of the tree.
It is, and that's that's a very good point, because if you're a vertically integrated public timber company like their predecessors, you only record your income for your shareholders when you sell products and net it against your costs. If you're one of these new TMOs, you record two types of profit. What did you sell your logs for, and what are your assets worth today? If your asset value went up, you still made money, whether there's any paper money or not.
Because that tree is growing in volume.
Well, it's growing in volume and allegedly in value, and they're able to, that's one of the advantages they have. And they've been able to exploit that on the market. So anyway, what you have is today, is you have a situation where you're producing homogeneous trees. They're all essentially the same size, the same age, and what does that do? It makes logging really easy. Because you can put a shear out there and they're incredibly productive and they're incredibly automated and they can build little piles of logs. They've got them on tethers now where they go down steep slopes and put them in nice neat piles. And then they have, even the towers today have grapples they're radio controlled with cameras, so you can go down and grab those little piles of trees, bring them to the landing, and then they have processors that will process them to the right lengths, and they can put them on a truck, and they can bring them in. And that all can be done with just a handful of people. And once they hit the mill, has anybody been through Simpson's Mill in Shelton, the new mill? 1 million feet a day. How many people? Because what is it? It's like probably like pumping a common uniform product through a pipe. These are little homogeneous trees that can be produced at incredibly high production rates with almost no people.
Done with a computer.
All done with a computer. Sensing, measuring, adjusting. So anyway, I guess at the end of this talk, I don't offer you a lot of hope for the Forest Products Industry. I'm actually trying to help a couple of economic development commissions right now on a consulting contract, trying to come up with new niches. This is up in Forks and up on the North Atlantic Peninsula, to try to find ways to generate new sustainable jobs.
Good luck.
Yeah, it's a very difficult thing to do. I'm sorry. Happy to try and answer any other questions. Go ahead, Mike.
Have you ever read Deep River?
I did. Deep River is a phenomenal book.
Yeah.
And it's technically very sound.
Well researched.
Yeah.
Just going from my family and stuff.
Yeah, very well. Yes, sir.
When did the short logger contractor come, what, in the middle 40s or?
The short loggers?
You know, I remember when they were 8 foot long.
Oh, yeah. For the pulp mills, paper mills, they actually had, just like they had in the South. South had the 62-inch cordwood, had the same situation here in the West. But that really was in the early stages before, when they were still logging grade logs that were going to the paper mills that were the minor species, hemlock, especially hemlock and whitewood. Yeah.
So the Jippo contractor, he come in the 40s sometime?
Yeah, Jippos have been around from way back when. They always were kind of on the outside. Actually, talk a little bit about that. If you look at them, they were kind of on the outside, but they were a lot, and this is true in the pulp and paper industry too. These little companies are the innovators. They can, if you look at the kind of the big ideas that come along, there were people like Pete Papik that said, we can do something different here, that were very innovative. Typically, it wasn't the big reindeers and the warehouses. I mean, they buy the latest equipment, but those equipment companies follow along right behind. And actually, the guys from Carl Zeller back in the archives talk about that. They said it wasn't our big company that came up with the ideas, or even the equipment companies. They follow along behind these innovative Jippos.
Wasn't the 8 foot logs a result of the 2x4, or I mean the stud mills?
No,
Not really?
the 8 foot log, this is kind of sad. In the South, and I assume it's here, I know it firsthand because they still do it, probably a little bit in the South, but certainly when I managed logging operations in the South, 8 foot log was the length of the log, the southern pine log, pretty much irrespective of diameter, that a pulpwood crew could lift my hand, put on their shoulder, and take it over and put it on a sideways
an old Pepsi truck or whatever to get it in. And I'm sad to say, a lot of those guys that loaded those were ex-slaves, working for the families that worked for years before. You see football teams in the South that have tremendous black athletes. I'm sure they came from some of those families, because these guys were buff, but very few white guys out there doing that. Yes, ma'am.
So who's logging on the road to Tokeland and out of South Bend? Who's logging that?
I don't know. I'd have to drive by. The odds are, I can tell you, it's a TIMO, it's a timber management organization, owns the land, and probably a contractor. Now, Weyerhaeuser, you can have 25% non-REIT qualifying assets and still be a REIT. So Weyerhaeuser keeps some logging operations of their own, but they're limited. Rainier and Weyerhaeuser had to spin off pulp mills, paper mills, all that stuff to become this tax advantage REIT. So that tax break changed the industry a lot as well.
The sad part about that tax break thing, we talked about the little small farmland owners.
Yep.
When timber was taxed, just like your house has their own tax.
Right.
So when that export market went up suddenly, your timberland worth a lot of money. Guess what? You aren't making any unless you sell the timber.
Yeah.
So a lot of people were forced to sell their timber or to
Yeah.
forfeit.
Yeah.
Lack of taxes. I worked on a lot of those little places. Rutherford was a good one.
Wow.
They had logged all that stuff, and then it got converted to other purposes because they didn't want to stay in the family. And it's an investment game, Roy, you're right.
And at the risk of offending somebody here, and I've already been pretty outspoken, but if there's one company that gets it, it's Red Emerson and Sierra Pacific.
Sierra Pacific.
He understands what's going on, and if you look at what he did in California, he's done in Washington, he's privately held, he's the biggest landowner in the United States today, maybe one of the wealthiest people in the United States, and producing commodities, but he builds a situation, he builds those 5-person sawmills. What do you do when you're the only game in town to buy those logs? Pretty soon you can buy the timberlands, and that's what he's doing. He just bought Seneca in Oregon, and stay away from Oregon, because Oregon's got so much public timber, it's pretty heavily contested. But he just bought Seneca timber, and he's putting $300-some million in that sawmill. And we'll be lucky if, this is Roy Nott. Default condition, Red Emerson could own the timber industry from the entire West Coast timber industry.
He was buying timber when everybody thought it was nuts.
Yeah, exactly. Southern Pacific Land
He paid
Company.
a heck of a price for it.
Yeah, so he paid prices like Sir James Goldsmith paid when he bought Southern Pacific Land Company, and look at what he's doing. But give him credit. He said, I figured this game out. It's not a quarter by quarter earnings per share corporate thing like these guys. This is a long-term play. I'm going to build mills, and he has a set way of building them. I'm going to build mills a certain way. They're going to be incredibly productive. And I'm going to wait, because I'm buying the logs, I'm going to wait for the timberland to get down to where it becomes affordable to me, and then I'm going to buy the timberlands. Yes, sir.
How did contracts for state and federal land change through your eras, and how did the owners compete for those contracts?
Contracts for state, and you're talking about the timber sales on?
Wouldn't the state and federal allow selective logging on their lands?
Oh, you get me started. What's going to be really candid? I don't think the state and federal government know what they're doing. They have, what Jim's went through it, they have a bureaucracy that is so big, if they wanted to be a commercial timberland operator, they couldn't survive. Because they have an archaeological specialist, and they have a specialist, and they have a specialist. And it takes them so long to do anything at the end of the day. And then beyond that, the ship has sailed. You now have these little logs that are being converted, logged by people that have optimized little logs,
and figured out how to saw these little logs. Aside from little sawmills, little loggers that may be able to handle those big logs, and somebody like Murphy in Elba that has a plywood mill, and he's taking some of those big capital forest logs and making veneer to take it down and put his LVL operations in California for you. They kind of missed the boat. I don't think they really know what they're doing. If somebody works for the DNR, I really apologize. I think they're just schizophrenic right now. They don't know where to go. They think they're so commercial operators, but they're not. And they're becoming less viable commercially every day. So, and I'm probably end up partnering with the Forest Service in this project. They're working with North End of the Peninsula. Because they own so many timberlands, DNR, North End of the Peninsula, et cetera. But I may not survive as a contractor too long because I talk just like that's what I talk to the client, so I may be fired. Good.
Well, thank you, sir. In the back, and we do have sore eyes. Thanks for coming.